Hello everyone, this is Suzanne at The Gospel Truth. We are back again today on this beautiful Wednesday, the day before Thanksgiving. How exciting. And we are reading from the book, The Hiding Place, Corrie Ten Boom. This is the story of when World War II broke out and everything changed for Corrie in her life and her family. And when we last left off in chapter 5, the invasion, Corrie once again has that dream that the 4 black horses in the Grote Market and Father, Betsy, William, and herself leaving Harlem, leaving all that was sure and safe, going where? So it's like she's had this dream. It sounds like a vision. Probably quite scary, too. I've had some nightmares that I woke up and was relieved that it wasn't true what was going on in my dream. Or how many of you have woke up crying from a dream, just sobbing, or frightened to death? I think we've all been there. All right, today we're going to pick up on chapter 6, The Secret Room. Each month, the occupations seemed to grow harsher, restrictions more numerous. The latest heartache for Dutchmen was an edict making it a crime to sing the Williamus, our national anthem. On a Sunday, 2 years after the occupation, Father, Betsy, and I were on our way to church in a small town where Peter had won the post of organist. The organ at Valsin was one of the finest in the country. Peter was already playing in the tall organ loft when we squeezed into the crowded pew. That was one thing the occupation had done for Holland. Churches were packed. After closing prayers were said, suddenly, electrically, the whole church sat at attention. Without preamble, every stop pulled out to full volume. Peter was playing the Wilhelmus, the national anthem. And that was forbidden. It's quite bold of Peter. Father, at 82, was the first one on his feet. Now everyone stood. From somewhere in back of us, a voice sang out the words. Another joined in, and another. We were all singing together at the top of our lungs our forbidden anthem. After we waited for Peter at the small side door of the church while people embraced him or shook his hand. But now that moment had passed. I was angry with him. The Gestapo was certain to hear about it. I thought of Nolly, home fixing Sunday dinner for us all. I thought of Peter's brothers and sisters. And what if Flip lost the principalship of the school for this year? For what had Peter risked so much? For a moment's defiance? At home, however, Peter was a hero. The only members of the household who felt as I did were the 2 Jewish women staying at Nolly's. One of these was an elderly lady from whom William had sent into hiding there. Katrine, as the family had rechristened her, was posing as the Van Warden's housemaid. The other woman was a young, blonde, blue-eyed Dutch Jew with flawless false identity papers supplied by the Dutch underground. The papers were so good, and Anneliese looked so unlike the Nazi stereotype of a Jew, that she went freely in and out of the house, pretending to be a friend of the family whose husband had died. Katrine and Anneliese could not understand any more than I could Peter doing something that would attract the attention of the authorities. Seems to me that you'd want to keep your head down low and not draw any attention to yourself, because the consequences would be severe. On Wednesday morning, just as Father and I were unlocking our workbenches, Peter's little sister, Kaki, burst into the shop. They came for Peter. They took him away. He had been taken to the prison in Amsterdam. Oh, dear. One evening 2 weeks later, Father and Betsy and I were seated around the dining room table, Father replacing watches in their pockets and Betsy doing needlework. A knock on the alley door made me glance in the window mirror. There, in the spring twilight, stood a woman. She carried a small suitcase, odd for the time of year, wore a fur coat and gloves. I ran down and opened the door. "Can I come in?" she asked. Her voice was high-pitched in fear. "Of course." I stepped back. The woman looked over her shoulder before moving into the little hallway. "My name is Clearmaker. I'm a Jew." "How do you do? Won't you come upstairs?" Father and Betsy stood up as we entered the dining room. Mrs. Clearmaker, my father, and my sister. Father drew out a chair from the table, and Mrs. Clearmaker sat down, still gripping her suitcase. She plunged into the story of how her husband had been arrested some months before, and her son had gone into hiding. Yesterday, the SD, the police who worked under the Gestapo, had ordered her to close the family store. She was afraid now to go back to the apartment above it. "In this household," Father said, "God's people are always welcome." Just 2 nights later, the same scene was repeated. A furtive knock at the side door, and this time an elderly couple standing outside. It was the same story, the same tight-clutched possessions, the same fearful glance. The story of neighbors arrested, the fear that tomorrow their turn would come. The next day, I made the trip to Hilversum. "William," I said, "we have 3 Jews staying right at the BG. Can you get places for them in the country?" "It's getting harder," William said. "They're feeling the food shortage even on the farms. I still have addresses, but they won't take anyone without a ration card." "But Jews aren't issued ration cards." For the first time, I wondered how he and Tyne were feeding the elderly men and women in their care. William continued, "I know, and ration cards can't be counterfeited. They're changed too often, and they're too easy to spot. Identity cards are different. I know several printers who do them. Of course, you'll need a photographer." Wow, so this seems like quite a chore to keep up with the counterfeit cards because they keep changing them and they can spot them. A photographer, printers, what was William talking about? "William, if people need ration cards and there aren't any counterfeit ones, what do you do?" William gestured vaguely. "Steal them." I stared at this Dutch Reformed clergyman. Then, "William, could you steal? I mean, could you get 3 stolen cards?" "No, Corrie. Every move I make is watched." He put an arm around my shoulder. "It will be far better for you to develop your own sources. The less connection with me, the less connection with anyone else, the better." On the crowded train home, I turned William's word over in my mind. Your own sources. That sounded so professional. How was I going to find a source of stolen ration cards? Who in the world did I know? A name appeared in my mind. Fred Kornstrand was the man who used to read the electric meter at the BG. Now Fred had a job working for the food office. Wasn't it in the department where ration books were issued? That evening after supper, I bumped over the brick streets to the Kornstrand house. The tires on my bicycle had finally given out, and I had joined the hundreds clattering about town on metal wheel rims. Fred came to the door and stared at me blankly when I said, "I want to talk to you about the Sunday service." He invited me in, closed the door, and said, "Now, what did you really come to see me about?" "Lord," I prayed silently, "if it is not safe to confide in Fred, stop this conversation now before it's too late." We've had some unexpected company at the BG. First it was a single woman, then a couple, and then I got back this afternoon another couple. I paused for an instant. They are Jews. Fred's expression did not change. I continued, "We can't find safe places for them, and they must provide something too, ration cards." Fred's eyes smiled. "Now I know why you came here. Is there any way you can give out extra cards, more than you report?" "No, Corrie. These cards have to be accounted for a dozen ways. They're checked and double-checked." The hope in me began to tumble, but Fred was frowning. Unless, he began, there were a holdup. The food office in Uric was robbed last month, but the men were caught. He was silent a while. If it happened at noon, he said slowly, when just the record clerk and I are there, and if they found us tied and gagged, he snapped his fingers. I know just the man who might do it. Do you remember the... Don't, I said, remembering William's warning. Don't tell me who or how. Just get the cards if you possibly can. How many do you need? I opened my mouth to say 5, but the number that astonishingly came out instead was 100. When Fred opened the door to me a week later, I gasped at the sight of him. Both eyes were a greenish purple, his lower lip cut and swollen. My friend took very naturally to the part, was all he would say. They had to make it look real that he was beat up and that indeed the cards were stolen. On the table, in a brown manila envelope, were 100 ration cards. Fred had already torn the continuing coupon from each one. This final coupon was presented at the food office the last day of each month in exchange for the next month's card. With these coupons, Fred could legally continue to issue us 100 cards. We agreed that it would be risky for me to keep coming to his house each month. What if he were to come to the BG instead, dressed in his old meterman uniform? The meter in the BG was in the back hall at the foot of the stairs. When I got home that afternoon, I pried up the thread of the bottom step and found a hollow space inside. We soon had our first test of the system. Fred was to come in through the shop as he always had, carrying the cards beneath his shirt. He would come at 5:30, when Betsy would have the back hall free of callers. To my horror, at 5:25, the shop door opened and in stepped a policeman. He was a tall man with orange-red hair whom I knew by name, Rolf, but little else. He had come to the 100th birthday party, but so had half the force. Rolf brought in a watch that needed cleaning, and he seemed in a mood to talk. My throat went dry, but Father chattered cheerfully as he took off the back of Rolf's watch and examined it. What were we going to do? There was no way to warn Fred. Promptly at 5:30, the door of the shop opened, and in he walked, dressed in his blue work clothes. It seemed to me that his chest was too thick, by a foot at least. Fred nodded to Father, the policeman, and me. Good evening. He strode through the door at the rear of the shop and shut it behind him. My ears strained to hear him. The door behind us opened again. So great was Fred's control that he had not ducked out of the alleyway exit, but came strolling back through the shop. Good evening, he said again. He reached the street door and was gone. We got away with it this time, but we were going to have to work out a warning system. Meanwhile, a great deal had happened at the BG. Supplied with ration cards, Mrs. Clearmaker and the elderly couple and the next arrivals and the next had found homes in safer locations. Still, the hunted people kept coming, and the needs were often more complicated than ration cards and addresses. If a Jewish woman became pregnant, where could she go to have her baby? If a Jew in hiding died, how could he be buried? Now, those are all things that you need to think about. This is a huge undertaking. And sometimes those type of things can be so overwhelming in our lives. Develop your own resources, William had said. From the moment Fred's name had popped into my mind, an uncanny realization had been growing in me. We were friends with half of Harlem. We knew someone in every business and service in the city. Excuse me. I think I caught a little bit of a cold. And Ron was sick yesterday, so excuse me for that, but let's continue on. Okay. We did not know the political views of all these people, but, and here I felt a strange leaping of my heart. God did. My job was simply to follow his leading, holding every decision up to him in prayer. I knew I was not clever or sophisticated. If the BG was becoming a meeting place for need and supply, it was through some strategy far higher than mine. I like the way Corrie takes everything to God. How often do we forget to do that? We need to pray over things all the time and ask for direction from God. A few nights after Fred's first meter-man visit, the alley bell rang long after curfew. I sped downstairs, expecting another refugee. To my surprise, close against the wall of the dark alley stood Kick. "Get your bicycle," he ordered with his usual abruptness. "And put on a sweater. I have some people I want you to meet." I knew it was useless to ask questions. Kick's bicycle was tireless too, and the rear wheel rims swathed in cloth. He wrapped mine also to keep down the clatter, and soon we were pedaling through the blacked-out streets of Harlem at a speed that would have scared me even in daylight. "Put a hand on my shoulder," Kick whispered. "I know the way." We crossed dark side streets, crested bridge, wheeled around corners. At last we crossed a broad canal and into the fashionable suburb of Ardenhout. We turned into a driveway beneath the shadowy trees. To my astonishment, Kick picked up my bicycle and carried both his and mine up the stairs. A serving girl with starched white apron and ruffled cap opened the door. The entrance hall was all jammed with bicycles. Then I saw him, one eye smiling at me, the other at the door, his vast stomach ahead of him. Pickwick! He led Kick and me into his drawing room, where sipping coffee and chatting in small groups was the most distinguished-looking group of men and women I had ever seen. But all my attention at that first moment was on the fragrant aroma in that room. Was it possible they were drinking real coffee? Pickwick drew me a cup from the silver urn on the sideboard. It was indeed coffee. After 2 years, here was rich, black, pungent dust coffee. He poured himself a cup, too, dropping in his usual 5 lumps of sugar as though rationing had never been invented. Another starched and ruffled maid passed a tray heaped high with cakes. Gobbling and gulping, I trailed about the room after Pickwick, shaking hands of the people he singled out. They were strange introductions, for no names were mentioned, only occasionally an address, and asked for Mrs. Smith. When I had met my 4th Smith, Kick explained with a grin, "It's the only last name in the underground." So this was the underground. But where were these people from? I had never laid eyes on any of them. Eventually, I realized with a shiver down my spine that I was meeting the national group. Their chief work, I learned from bits of conversation, was liaison with England and the Free Dutch forces fighting elsewhere on the continent. They also maintained the underground route through which downed Allied plane crews reached the North Sea coast. They were instantly sympathetic, and with my efforts to help Harlem Jews, I blushed to hear Pickwick describe me as the head of the operation in the city. A hollow space under the stairs and some haphazard friendships were not an operation. The others were obviously professional. But they greeted me with grave courtesy, murmuring what they had to offer: false identity papers, the use of a car with official government plates, signature forgery. In a far corner of the room, Pickwick introduced me to a little man with a wispy goatee. "Our host informs me," the man began formally, "that your headquarters building lacks a secret room. This is a danger for all. With your permission, I will pay you a visit in the coming week." Years later, I would learn that he was one of the most famous architects in Europe. I knew him as only Mr. Smith. Just before Kick and I started our dash back to the BG, Pickwick slipped his arm through mine. "My dear, I have good news. I understand that Peter is about to be released." So he was, 3 days later, thinner, paler, and not a whit daunted by his 2 months in a concrete cell. We used up a month's sugar ration baking cakes for his welcome home party. A month's sugar ration for baking cakes for his welcome home party. How often do we just bake our cakes with sugar? We have tea, we have coffee. We've never stood in ration lines, maybe our grandparents and our great-grandparents. But that's quite a gesture. One morning, soon after, the first customer in the shop was a small, thin, bearded man named Smith. Father took his jeweler's glass from his eye. If there was one thing he loved better than making a new acquaintance, it was discovering a link with an old one. "Smith," he said, "I know several Smiths in Amsterdam. Are you by any chance related to the family who—" "Father," I interrupted, "this is the man I told you about. He's come to inspect the house." "A building inspector? Then you must be the Smith with offices in the Grote Hout Straat." "Father," I pleaded, "he's not a building inspector, and his name is not Smith." As I led Mr. Smith into the back hall, we heard Father musing to himself. "I once knew a Smith on Koningsstraat." Mr. Smith examined and improved the hiding place for ration cards beneath the bottom step. He also pronounced acceptable the warning system we had worked out. This was a triangle-shaped wooden sign addressing Apana watches that I had placed in the dining room window. As long as the sign was in place, it was safe to enter. But when I showed him a cubbyhole behind the corner cupboard in the dining room, he shook his head. Some ancient redesigning of the house had left a crawl space in that corner, and we had been secreting jewelry, silver coins, and other valuables there. Not only had the rabbi brought us this library, but other Jewish families had brought their treasures to the BG for safekeeping. The space was large enough that we believed a person could crawl in there if necessary, but Mr. Smith dismissed it without a second glance. "First place, they'd look. Don't bother to change it, though. It's only silver. We're interested in saving people, not things." He started up the narrow corkscrew stairs, and as he mounted, so did his spirits. He paused in delight at the odd-placed landings, pounded on the crooked walls, and laughed aloud as the floor levels of the two old houses continued out of phase. "What an impossibility," he said in an awestruck voice. "What an unbelievable, unpredictable impossibility. Mrs. Ten Boom, if all the houses were constructed like this one, you would see before you a less worried man." At the top of the stairs, he entered my bedroom. "This is it," he exclaimed. "You want your hiding place as high as possible. Gives you the best chance to reach it while the search is on below." And here's a picture. And looks like they're going to build a wall there. So they're going to be constructing that hiding place. Mr. Smith began measuring. He moved the wobbly old wardrobe away from the wall and pulled my bed into the center of the room. "This is where the false wall will go." Excitedly, he penciled a line along the floor 30 inches from the back wall. He stood up and gazed at it. "That is as big as I dare," he said. "It will easily take a cot mattress, though." Over the next few days, Mr. Smith and his workmen were in and out of our house. They never knocked. At each visit, each man carried in something: tools and a folded newspaper, a few bricks in a briefcase. I venture to wonder if a wooden wall would not be easier to build. "Wood sounds hollow," he said. "No, brick. Brick's the only thing for false walls." After the wall was up, the plasterer came, then the carpenter, finally the painter. 6 days after he had begun, Mr. Smith called Father, Betsy, and me to see. We stood in the doorway and gaped. The smell of fresh paint was everywhere, but surely nothing in this room was newly painted. All 4 walls had that streaked and grimy look that old rooms got in coal-burning Harlem. The ancient molding ran unbroken around the ceiling, chipped and peeling here and there, obviously undisturbed for 150 years. Old water stains streaked the back wall, a wall that even I, who had lived half a century in this room, could scarcely believe that it was not the original, but set back a precious 2.5 feet from the true wall of the building. Built-in bookshelves, old sagging shelves with the same water stains as the wall behind them, ran along this false wall. Down in the far left-hand corner, beneath the bottom shelf, a sliding panel, 2 feet high and 2 feet wide, opened into the secret room. Mr. Smith stooped and pulled this panel up. On hands and knees, Betsy and I crawled into the narrow room behind it. Inside, we could stand up, sit, or even stretch out one at a time on a single mattress. A concealed vent allowed air to enter from outside. "Keep a water jug in there," said Mr. Smith, crawling in behind us. "Change the water once a week. Hardtack and vitamins keep indefinitely. Anytime there's anyone in the house whose presence is unofficial, all possessions except the clothes on his back must be stored in here." Dropping to our knees again, we crawled out single file. "Move back into your bedroom," he told me, everything exactly as before. With his fist, he struck the wall above the bookshelves. "The Gestapo could search for a year," he said. "They'll never find this one." All right. So they are in preparation to help the Jews in hiding them. They constructed this false wall, make sure there's going to be water in it, and change it out every 2 weeks. And it is quite a dangerous thing that they will be doing, and they know that. And they know that if they're caught, it will be very bad for them. Most likely, they would all be taken away. It was a crime to hide the Jews. So that's it for our reading today. And chapter 7 says, Eusie, E-U-S-I-E, is the next chapter. Well, it's a good thing Peter was only in jail for 2 months. That was quite a bold thing that he did. I think sometimes the spirit hits us or something hits us that we are defiant. And he took a risk and he broke the rules and he got caught. And now he's out again. I wonder if they're even going to keep a closer eye on him now because he dared to defy them and he was caught. Very interesting book, isn't it? All right, that's it for today. This is Suzanne at The Gospel Truth. I hope you're enjoying The Hiding Place as much as I am. And Lord willing, I'll be back on Friday with another chapter. I hope you have a great Thanksgiving tomorrow. I know how blessed I am, and I have many, many things to be thankful for. And one of the things is all of you supporting my channel, loving me, praying for me. I can't even begin to tell you how thankful I am for all of you. All right, you take care, and Lord willing, I'll be back on Friday. Bye-bye.